The clang of the heavy steel gate resonated through the yard, a daily punctuation mark to the desolate rhythm of ironwood. Dust devils, stirred by the morning wind, danced across the cracked concrete, carrying the scent of stale sweat, institutional cleaner, and a faint acrid tang of something indefinable and vaguely metallic. Barbed wire glinted atop the 20-foot walls, a constant reminder of the world left behind, or perhaps the world that had cast them out. Figures in faded gray shuffled or strode, their movements a tapestry of resignation and defiant energy. Conversations, when they happened, were clipped, laced with an undercurrent of suspicion, or boomed with forced bravado. In a rare patch of sunlight near the far wall, where a stubborn weed managed to push through a hairline fracture in the concrete, Alara Vance sat. Her back was against the cool, rough stone, her knees drawn up. A tattered paperback balanced on them. It was an old astronomy text, its cover faded to an almost indistinguishable blur, but the diagrams of distant nebulae and the intricate dance of celestial bodies still captivated her. Her fingers, long and slender, traced the delicate lines of a constellation chart. Her expression was one of quiet absorption, a world away from the gritty reality of ironwood, a universe away from the clamor and the watchful eyes. She had a knack for finding these small pockets of calm, for carving out a mental sanctuary amidst the ceaseless din. It wasn't an act, it was simply how she existed, a silent observer in a loud world. A sudden shift in the yard's atmospheric pressure preceded him. Rex, the Hammer Granger. His name, self-proclaimed and ruthlessly enforced, echoed through the prison. He moved with a predatory swagger, shoulders hunched, arms swinging just a little too wide, as if daring anyone to impede his progress. His frame was a hulking mass of muscle, honed not by discipline, but by raw, unthinking aggression. A constellation of faded tattoos adorned his neck and arms, remnants of a life spent in fleeting, violent skirmishes. His eyes, small and close-set, perpetually scanned the yard, seeking any flicker of defiance, any sign of weakness he could exploit. He was a force of nature in Ironwood, a tempest of volatile energy that left a trail of unease and intimidated silence in his wake. Today, his focus seemed to be drifting. He had just finished a particularly loud argument with a new arrival over a misplaced deck of cards, his voice a gravelly roar that had drawn all eyes. Now, sated with the fear he'd instilled, he was looking for a new target, a fresh opportunity to assert his unchallenged reign. The air around him seemed to thicken, the casual chatter of the yard dimming to a hushed murmur as he passed. Inmates subtly shifted their weight, avoided eye contact, or busied themselves with trivial tasks, anything to escape the Hammer's notice. He thrived on this fear, mistaking it for respect, a shield against his own gnawing insecurities. Alara, however, remained immersed in her cosmic journey. A faint smile touched her lips as she read about the vast emptiness between galaxies, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic confines surrounding her. She wasn't ignoring him. She simply wasn't acknowledging him. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible distinction, but in Ironwood, where every interaction was a negotiation of power, it was a profound act of defiance. Her quietude was often misconstrued as timidity, a blank canvas upon which others projected their assumptions. But beneath that calm exterior lay a reservoir of steel, forged in fires that few in Ironwood could comprehend. Her resilience wasn't about shouting louder or striking harder. It was about enduring, about maintaining her inner landscape despite the external storms. Granger's gaze, sweeping across the yard, snagged on her still form. He paused, a sneer twisting his thick lips. The sight of her, so utterly disengaged from the grim reality, so seemingly at peace, grated on him. It was an affront to his chaotic order, a challenge to his self-appointed dominion. He saw her as an easy mark, another quiet lamb ripe for the shearing. He started towards her, his heavy boots scuffing against the concrete, each step a deliberate announcement of his approach. The murmur of the yard died completely, replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a basketball from another section of the prison. All eyes, furtive and tense, watched the inevitable collision course. Alara, still engrossed in the mysteries of the universe, remained oblivious, or so it seemed to the hammer. He took another step, then another, a shadow falling over her small, sunlit corner. The quiet corner of Ironwood was about to get very loud indeed. A shadow falls. The midday sun, a pale imitation of warmth in the Ironwood yard, cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. Rex, the hammer Granger, a man built like a misplaced boulder, stood surveying his domain. His eyes, the color of tarnished brass, roamed over the huddled groups, the solitary figures pacing the perimeter, the endless monotony of it all. He craved the familiar thrill of establishing his superiority, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. He needed a fresh canvas, a new opportunity to remind everyone who held the reins of this concrete kingdom. His gaze snagged on a figure seated alone on a splintered bench, tucked away beneath the meager shade of a dying oak. Alara Vance. She was a wisp of a woman, her frame almost swallowed by the rough-spun uniform. He'd seen her before, always quiet, always with that damned book. She'd never met his eye, never challenged a single order, just melted into the background like a ghost. Perfect, he thought, a predatory grin stretching his lips. Her silence to Rex wasn't a sign of introspection or resilience. It was an open invitation, a glaring signpost pointing to weakness. A lamb among wolves, ready for the culling. He began his slow, deliberate advance, each heavy bootfall a small declaration of intent. The yard, usually a cacophony of muttered conversations and the clink of chains, seemed to quiet. Heads turned, hushed whispers rippled through the groups. Everyone knew what a focused Rex meant. It was a macabre theater, and Rex was always the star. He watched Alara as he approached, expecting her to flinch, to cower, to at least acknowledge his overwhelming presence. But she didn't. Her head remained bowed, her gaze fixed on the worn pages in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was an affront, a silent defiance that stoked the embers of his simmering rage. The sun, now directly behind him, elongated his shadow, stretching it across the yard like a grotesque dark tide. It crept over the rough concrete, then climbed the back of the bench, finally engulfing Alara completely. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken anticipation. Still, Alara didn't stir. Her fingers, slender and surprisingly strong, continued to trace lines across the ancient text. A vein throbbed in Rex's temple. This wasn't just about asserting dominance. It was about forcing acknowledgement from someone who seemed utterly oblivious to his power. He stopped a few feet from her, his massive frame blocking the last vestiges of light. The murmur in the yard had died down entirely. Even the guards on the watchtowers seemed to hold their breath. The only sounds were the distant clang of metal on metal from the workshops, and the faint rustle of pages in Alara's hands. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel churning. Well, well, what have we here? His voice, usually a booming instrument of intimidation, was low and laced with a dangerous silkiness. He relished the moment, the palpable tension radiating from every corner of the yard. Alara, however, remained a still, quiet island in the storm he was brewing. He saw her shoulders, slender but surprisingly square, tighten almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something. Not fear, he realized with a jolt, but perhaps annoyance crossed her face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He leaned in, letting his shadow swallow her entirely. The game, he decided, had just begun, and he intended to win. The shove and the stare. The oppressive heat of the yard clung to Rex like a suffocating shroud, stoking the embers of his simmering rage. He bore down on Alara, his shadow eclipsing the open pages of her book. A dark presage. A sneer contorted his lips, revealing a glint of gold where a natural tooth should have been. "Still too good for us, princess?" he grumbled, his voice a low thrum that cut through the yard's pervasive din. "Buried in your stories, while the rest of us bake." Alara remained unfazed, her gaze unwavering on the intricate script. The faintest tremor at the corner of her mouth, an almost imperceptible dismissal, chafed Rex's already raw nerves. Her quiet insolence, so subtle yet so potent, was a gauntlet thrown, a silent dare to push her, to shatter her composure. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he bellowed, the sudden eruption of sound making nearby inmates flinch. Slowly, Alara raised her head. Her eyes, the verdant hue of moss after a spring rain, met his. No fear resided there, only a cool, unwavering appraisal that sent Rex's blood to a furious boil. He'd seen fear 1,000 times. This was something altogether different. It was as if she were dissecting him, cataloging his frailties, finding him utterly lacking. He couldn't bear it. The unspoken judgment in her gaze stung more than any direct insult. With a guttural cry, fueled by a lifetime of insecurity and a desperate need for dominion, Rex thrust out his arm. His hand collided with Alara's shoulder with brutal force, a heavy, unthinking shove designed to send her sprawling. The thick leather-bound book, her grandmother's cherished gift, flew from her grip, landing with a muffled thud in the dusty gravel. Its pages fluttered like a final whispered breath before settling. Alara herself stumbled, her body swaying precariously for a moment. A collective gasp rippled through the yard, a sudden sharp intake of air that silenced the usual clang of weights and the murmur of conversation. Even Officer Miller, leaning against the recreation block's far wall, straightened up, a furrow deepening in his brow. Violence was commonplace, but this particular act felt singular, unprovoked. Rex, emboldened by what he perceived as a triumph, puffed out his chest, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "Maybe that'll teach you to pay attention, princess," he sneered, kicking a loose pebble towards the fallen book. But Alara didn't fall. She caught herself, her worn canvas shoes digging into the loose earth, finding a precarious foothold. She remained upright, her shoulders squaring, her body humming with a sudden coiled tension. The air around her seemed to thicken, crackling with an almost palpable energy. Then she turned. Her eyes, moments ago so placid, so absorbed in the world of words, were no longer moss green. They were storm gray, shot through with glints of cold steel. The deep, thoughtful pools had vanished, replaced by an intensity that was almost frightening. They narrowed, focusing on Rex with unnerving precision, stripping away his bravado, seeing straight through to the trembling core of the man beneath the bluster. It wasn't anger that flickered in their depths, but something far more primal, more dangerous. It was the absolute, unblinking focus of a predator. The smirk slid from Rex's face, the triumphant gleam in his eyes faded, replaced by a flicker of genuine apprehension. He had anticipated tears, defiance, perhaps even a scream. He had expected anything but this. This silent, calculating stare that seemed to siphon the very air from his lungs. The yard, still hushed, watched with bated breath, suddenly aware that they were witnessing not the breaking of a quiet girl, but the awakening of something entirely unforeseen. The game had just changed. The flicker of memory. The unexpected force sent Ilara stumbling backward, the worn leather of her book slipping from her grasp. Rex's sneer, a grotesque mask of petty triumph, was the last thing she registered before the world tilted. But even as the gravel shifted beneath her worn boots, a lifetime of muscle memory, honed through countless hours of rigorous practice, asserted itself. Her left foot instinctively shot out and planted firmly, arresting her fall. Her right arm, a blur of motion, snaked out not to grasp at air, but to counterbalance, a fluid, almost unconscious adjustment that defied the crude shove. She didn't fall. She merely swayed, a reed bending in a sudden gust, then uprighted herself, her gaze now fixed on Rex, no longer placid, but piercing. The momentary disorientation, instead of leading to panic, opened a sudden, unexpected conduit to the past. It wasn't a gentle recollection. It was a torrent, a rapid-fire montage of images and sensations. The scent of polished wood in the dojo, the rhythmic thud of bare feet on the mat, the guttural shouts of her instructors. Her mind, in that fractional instant, became a high-speed projector, cycling through years of disciplined training. She saw Master Hiroki, his face etched with ancient wisdom, demonstrating a block, his movements economical, precise. Anticipate, Ilara. The true warrior sees the strike before it lands, feels the intention, not just the impact. His words, a whispered echo, resonated in her ears. She felt again the sting of a misplaced kick, the burn in her muscles after endless katas, the sheer, unyielding demand for perfection. Then came the images of sparring, the controlled aggression, the dizzying dance of attack and defense. She remembered the feeling of her own body, a finely tuned instrument, responding without conscious thought. The precise angle of a palm strike, designed to stun, not maim. The subtle shift of weight that could turn a retreat into a powerful counterattack. The deep, centered breathing that steadied her core, even under duress. Her mind conjured a specific lesson, a vivid memory of her first true breakthrough. She had been struggling with a complex, disarming technique, her movements stiff, her focus fragmented. Master Hiroki had approached her, his presence calm but insistent. Ilara, you are thinking too much. Let your body remember. It knows the path. Trust its wisdom. He had guided her hands, slowly, deliberately, through the sequence, until the intricate movements flowed, a seamless extension of her will. She had felt a surge of exhilaration then, a profound connection to the power she knew she possessed. Now, standing before Rex, the memory wasn't just a nostalgic echo. It was a blueprint, overlaying the chaotic present with a clear, defined structure. The noise of the yard, the jeers, the whispers, all faded into a dull hum. Her peripheral vision sharpened, picking out the subtle shifts in Rex's stance, the slight tension in his shoulders, the telltale clench of his jaw. He was still gloating, still reveling in his perceived victory, completely oblivious to the transformation unfolding before him. Her breath, without her conscious command, deepened, slowing to the steady, controlled rhythm she had practiced for years. The familiar warmth spread through her limbs, a latent energy awakening. Every nerve ending seemed to hum with heightened awareness. She felt the cool air against her skin, The rough texture of her prison uniform, the faint tremor of the ground beneath her feet. It was as if her senses had been recalibrated, fine-tuned to an extraordinary degree. Her gaze, now unwavering, locked onto Rex. The predatory intensity that had momentarily flashed in her eyes deepened, becoming a steady, unwavering flame. She no longer saw a crude bully. She saw a series of vulnerabilities, a collection of exposed targets, a puzzle waiting to be solved with the precise, efficient movements she had mastered. The quiet girl who had been reading moments before was gone, replaced by something ancient, formidable, and utterly focused. The fallen book, its pages splayed open on the dusty ground, seemed a forgotten relic of a distant past. Lightning strike. The collective gasp that rippled through the yard was swiftly followed by an eerie silence. Rex, his face a mask of furious disbelief, remained frozen, his arm still outstretched from the shove. But Alara was no longer the still, placid figure he'd tried to dominate. The world, for her, had narrowed to a pinprick, all sound and fury muted, every detail sharpened. The scent of stale sweat and metal, the gritty feel of the concrete beneath her worn boots, the almost imperceptible sway of Rex's powerful frame. It all coalesced into a single, crystalline moment. Her hand moved. It wasn't a punch, not a flailing blow. It was an extension of her will, a blur of controlled energy. The other inmates, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, saw only a flash. Rex, hulking and confident a second ago, felt a jolt, a sudden searing pressure. It wasn't the impact of a fist, but something far more insidious, more precise. Alara's fingers, honed by years of practice, found their mark. Not the jaw, not the temple, but a less obvious yet incredibly sensitive point nestled beneath Rex's ear, where the carotid artery pulsed close to the surface, where nerves converged in a delicate dance. It was a pressure point, a technique taught by Master Hiroki for disabling an opponent with minimal force, a strategy for neutralizing aggression without resorting to brute strength. Her thumb dug in, not with excessive power, but with focused intent, a practiced precision that bypassed muscle and bone to target the very core of his balance. A strange, guttural sound escaped Rex's throat, a half-choke, half-gasp that died before it fully formed. His eyes, seconds ago blazing with contempt, glazed over, a flicker of bewildered surprise crossing his features before dimming entirely. His imposing frame, which had seemed as unyielding as the prison walls themselves, began to list. It was a slow, almost graceful descent at first, then accelerated, gravity asserting its undeniable claim. A collective intake of breath from the onlookers punctuated the sudden stillness. Rex, the self-proclaimed king of the yard, the undisputed hammer, folded in on himself, his knees buckling with an unnatural swiftness. His massive body hit the concrete with a sickening thud that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. A puff of dust rose from beneath him, a tiny, almost theatrical flourish to mark his abrupt unconsciousness. He lay there, a crumpled heap of muscle and bluster, utterly still. Alara stood over him, her chest rising and falling evenly. The storm that had raged within her had dissipated, leaving behind a profound stillness. Her eyes, no longer haunted by memory, were clear and sharp, scanning the stunned faces around her. The yard was a tableau of frozen disbelief. No one moved, no one spoke. The guards, usually quick to intervene in any scuffle, were equally transfixed, their hands hovering over their radios, their expressions mirroring the shock of the inmates. A tremor ran through the crowd, a collective shudder that was part fear, part dawning realization. The quiet, bookish woman they had dismissed as insignificant had, in a single, fluid motion, disarmed their tormentor. The balance of power, so rigidly established for so long, had been shattered in an instant. The air crackled with a new, unsettling energy. Ilara, the unassuming scholar, had become something else entirely. The yard, for the first time in a very long time, belonged to no one, and everyone knew it. Silence and sirens. A collective gasp, the loudest Ilara had ever heard within Ironwood's stark confines, ripped through the yard. It wasn't born of terror, but profound, disbelieving shock. Rex, the yard's immovable monument, lay crumpled on the asphalt, his colossal frame appearing strangely diminished in repose. The heavy thud of his fall had been swallowed by the sudden, profound silence that followed. Sunlight, usually a harsh, unyielding glare, seemed to soften, bathing the scene in muted tones, as if even the sky held its breath. Ilara stood over him, her chest barely stirring with breath, her hands still slightly raised, caught in the aftermath. The adrenaline's fiery grip was releasing, replaced by a cold, tingling awareness of every eye riveted upon her. She hadn't intended injury, merely incapacitation, a halt to the aggression. Yet Rex's abrupt collapse, its sheer finality, had startled even her. The raw, primal power she had unleashed, dormant for so long, had surprised her with its devastating efficacy. A whistle shrieked, a piercing, insistent wail that tore the stillness. Then another, closer this time, accompanied by the heavy thud of boots on concrete. Officer Miller, his face a mask of grim resolve, was the first to burst through the gate, his hand instinctively near his sidearm, though seasoned enough not to draw it amidst the throng. Behind him, two younger, less weathered guards sprinted, their expressions a confused blend of alarm and apprehension. "What in the hell is going on here?" Miller bellowed, his voice carving through the lingering shock. His eyes, typically sharp and assessing, darted from Ilara to Rex, then swept across the inmates' frozen faces. He registered the wide-eyed awe, the flickering fear, and a dawning respect he'd never before witnessed in this yard. This was no mere brawl. This was something entirely different. He reached Rex first, dropping to a knee beside the prone figure. Rex's face was ashen, a thin line of blood tracing from his temple where he'd struck the ground. Miller's practiced fingers went immediately to his pulse point. Nothing. He tried another, pressing harder against the carotid. A faint flutter, barely perceptible. His eyes widened slightly. This wasn't a simple knockout. This was grave. "Granger! Rex!" he barked, slapping the man's cheek, but there was no response. Rex remained utterly limp, a dead weight. The other guards arrived, whistles still clutched in their hands, their eyes mirroring Miller's dawning horror. "Get the medics! Now!" Miller snapped, his voice tight with urgency. "Code red. We need an ambulance, stat. He's barely breathing." One of the younger guards fumbled for his radio, his face pale. The other, still reeling, stared at Ilara. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. There was no defiance, no triumph, just a quiet, almost melancholic resolve. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache. She had acted, had defended, but the aftermath was a heavy cloak of responsibility. The yard, which had been silent, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Whispers rose like steam, hushed and incredulous. "Did you see that?" She just dropped him. "Rex is out cold." The bravado that had filled the air moments before Rex's challenge was replaced by a palpable tension, a fear less about the guards and more about the seismic implications of what had just transpired. The prison's internal ecosystem had been violently disrupted. The apex predator had been felled by the most unlikely of challengers. Miller, meanwhile, barked orders into his own radio, his voice strained. Possible carotid trauma. Unconscious. Significant head impact. Get them here, now. He checked Rex's pupils, shining his small tactical flashlight into them. They were dilated, sluggish. This was beyond his first aid training. This was a medical emergency. A life or death situation he hadn't anticipated in a simple yard confrontation. He glanced at Ilara, still standing perfectly still, a lone sentinel amidst the chaos. Her face was unreadable, but in her eyes, he thought he saw a flicker of regret, perhaps even a hint of fear. She hadn't sought this. He knew that much about her. She was the quiet one, the bookworm, the one who kept to herself. And now, she was the one who had brought down the beast. The irony was not lost on him. The distant wail of sirens began to penetrate Ironwood's thick walls, growing steadily louder. They were coming, not just for Rex, but for the new reality that had just been forged on the sun-baked asphalt. The silence had ended, but the true repercussions were only just beginning to reverberate. Ilara, watching the guards scramble, the inmates murmur, and the first aid kit being rushed over, knew that her carefully constructed invisibility had been irrevocably shattered. The quiet had served its purpose, allowing her to observe, to learn, to prepare. Now the noise had begun, the unflappable scholar. The collective gasp that had ripped through the yard, now fractured into a cacophony of shouts, gasps, and the urgent scuffing of boots. Rex, a hulking monument to prison brutality, lay sprawled in the dust, a grotesque puppet with its strings cut. His blood, a dark stain blossoming on the drab concrete, was the only thing moving with any discernible speed. Yet, amidst the rising tide of hysteria, one figure remained unnervingly still. Ilara Vance, her slight frame silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun, seemed utterly detached from the carnage she had wrought. Her gaze, which had been fixed on Rex's tumbling form, now drifted to the ground. There, nestled amongst the grit and a solitary forgotten cigarette butt, lay her book, a well-worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its cover slightly scuffed, its pages dog-eared from countless readings. With a deliberate, almost graceful movement, Ilara bent at the waist. It wasn't a hurried lunge, nor a hesitant stoop. It was the unhurried inclination of someone reaching for a dropped handkerchief in a quiet library. Her fingers, slender and unmarred, closed around the spine of the book. As she straightened, her eyes, the color of stormy seas, swept across the yard. There was no flicker of triumph, no shadow of fear, no tremor of regret. Her face remained a placid canvas, an unreadable tableau of serene composure. Officer Miller, his face a mask of disbelief, felt a chill creep up his spine. He had witnessed countless brawls, countless acts of defiance and desperation in his years within these walls. He had seen men rage, weep, and beg. But he had never seen anyone, especially not the quiet, bookish Ilara Vance, inflict such devastating violence and then retrieve a philosophical text with the calm detachment of a librarian. It was as if the brutal takedown of Rex the Hammer Granger was merely a minor interlude in her intellectual pursuits. The other guards, a few of whom were already reaching for their radios, exchanged bewildered glances. Their initial instinct to rush Ilara, to subdue her, had been momentarily paralyzed by the sheer incongruity of the scene. What kind of inmate, after shattering the prison's most formidable bully, simply picked up a book? The inmates, a sea of hardened faces, were equally mesmerized. The usual post-fight commentary, the jeers, the boasts, the nervous murmurs, had been replaced by an eerie silence. They watched Ilara, a woman who had been practically invisible until moments ago, as if she were a new species, a creature beyond their comprehension. Her movements, so fluid and precise during the fight, were now equally fluid and precise in their mundane normalcy. It defied every expectation, every ingrained understanding of prison hierarchy and human reaction. Ilara's gaze lingered on Miller for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unidentifiable in their depths. Perhaps a quiet acknowledgement, perhaps a challenge, perhaps simply an observation. Then, without breaking her tranquil expression, she tucked the book under her arm, the worn pages resting against her side. She looked at Rex's inert form, the widening pool of crimson, the terrified faces of his cronies, and then back at the general prison population. She didn't offer a word, a nod, or even a sigh. It was as though she had merely tidied a loose thread in the fabric of the day. The first blare of a siren, distant but growing, finally broke the spell. It was the sound of the outside world intruding, of protocols and procedures about to be unleashed. Miller, jolted back to his duties, barked orders into his radio, his voice raspy with an unfamiliar strain. "Medical emergency. Yard A. Code Red." As the medics, a blur of white and urgency, burst through the gate, Ilara remained where she was, a quiet sentinel in the storm. Her presence, unwavering and strangely potent, continued to dominate the yard, even as the focus shifted to Rex's desperate struggle for life. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, with a new and unsettling understanding. The quiet scholar, it seemed, was anything but unflappable. She was, in fact, an earthquake, and the ground beneath Ironwood had just begun to tremble. Warden Thorne's discovery. The digital chime of a new incident report sliced through the usual hum of Warden Thorne's office, a sound she'd come to associate with varying degrees of disruption to Ironwood's fragile peace. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, fingers steepled, and fixed her gaze on the glowing screen. The subject line, stark against the dark background, read, "Assault. Yard incident. Vance. Ilara versus Granger. Rex." Thorne's eyebrow arched imperceptibly. Rex Granger was a known quantity, a hulking brute whose aggression was as predictable as the sunrise. Ilara Vance, on the other hand, was an enigma, a librarian by trade, imprisoned for what Thorne vaguely recalled as a white-collar crime, and until now, utterly unremarkable. She clicked the report open. Officer Miller's concise, almost clinical prose detailed the altercation, Granger's initial provocation, Ilara's unforeseen and extremely effective counterattack, and Granger's subsequent, swift incapacitation. Thorne scrolled down, her eyes scanning the witness statements. Inmates described Ilara's movements as too fast to see, like a blur, and surgical. Miller's own account noted the unusual precision and lack of wasted motion. Most striking, though, was the final paragraph, detailing Ilara's subsequent retrieval of a book and her calm departure. Meditations, the report specified. Thorne felt a prickle of genuine curiosity. This wasn't a typical prison yard brawl. This was something else entirely. She closed the report and immediately opened a new window, typing a request to her records department. Retrieve full file. Ilara Vance. Expedite. Thorne preferred to make her assessments based on comprehensive data, not on the sensationalized accounts of inmates or the often embellished reports of guards. She had seen too many quiet individuals erupt under pressure, but rarely with such devastating, detached efficiency. An hour later, a notification pinged. Elara Vance's digitized file landed on Thorne's desktop. The initial pages were mundane: birth certificate, academic records, the details of her conviction for embezzlement, a complex scheme involving shell corporations and offshore accounts. It painted a picture of a brilliant, if ethically compromised, mind. Thorne scrolled past the usual biographical information, waiting for the anomaly that would explain the yard incident. Then she found it. A section titled Extracurricular Activities and Personal Achievements. Thorne clicked, and the screen populated with a list that made her draw in a sharp breath. Not the usual high school clubs or community service, but a litany of martial arts accolades. National Collegiate Taekwondo Champion, 2008, 2009, 2010. International Kumite Federation Gold Medalist, Lightweight Division, 2011, Pan-Asian Sambo Championship, Silver Medalist, 2012. The entries continued, detailing a consistent, elite-level career spanning nearly a decade. There were photographs. A younger Elara Vance, lean and focused, adorned with medals, her face a mask of fierce concentration. Thorne leaned forward, a slow smile spreading across her face. The pieces clicked into place with satisfying precision. Rex Granger hadn't just tangled with a quiet intellectual. He'd assaulted a finely tuned instrument of combat, a seasoned competitor whose movements were honed by years of rigorous training and competition. The blur, the surgical precision, the lack of wasted motion. It all made perfect, terrifying sense. This wasn't a sudden, desperate outburst. It was a practiced, disciplined response. A professional at work, albeit in the most unconventional of arenas. She thought of the yard, the stunned silence, the guards' baffled expressions. And then Elara, retrieving her book, turning a page, utterly unperturbed. It wasn't detachment. It was the composure of a master who had merely executed a well-rehearsed maneuver. The incident wasn't an act of violence born of desperation, but a reassertion of boundaries, a declaration of capability. Thorne picked up her desk phone and dialed Officer Miller's direct line. It rang twice before he answered, his voice weary. "Miller here." "Officer Miller," Thorne began, her voice calm but with an underlying current of steel. "Regarding the incident with Vance and Granger." "Yes, Warden. Still waiting on the medics to give us an update on Granger. He's got a cracked rib and a pretty severe concussion. Vance, she's in isolation, quiet as ever." "I've reviewed Vance's full file," Thorne continued, ignoring the details of Granger's injuries. "And I believe we have a clearer understanding of what transpired. It appears Ms. Vance is a highly decorated martial artist, a champion, in fact." Silence hung on the line, thick with Miller's disbelief. Then, a slow, drawn-out exhale. "You're telling me Rex Granger got taken down by a librarian, who's also a black belt?" His voice held a mixture of awe and exasperation. "More than a black belt, Miller, a world-class competitor. What you witnessed today wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration." Thorne paused, letting the implications sink in. "The power dynamics in the yard, officer, just shifted. And not in the way anyone anticipated." She ended the call, a new, complex challenge forming in her mind. Ironwood had just acquired a new, formidable, and entirely unexpected force. And Warden Thorne, for the first time in a long time, felt genuinely intrigued by the unpredictable path ahead. A new respect. The mess hall, usually a clangorous symphony of complaints and hushed dealings, vibrated with a different energy the morning after Rex's unfortunate incident. A low thrum of disbelief, of rehashed stories, of a new, unsettling reality permeated the air. Heads swiveled as Alara entered, a small, unassuming figure in the faded uniform. The usual gauntlet of jostles, leers, and muttered insults evaporated. Instead, the crowd parted in a hushed, almost reverent deference. Officer Miller, by the exit, observed the procession. Prison yard brawls rarely stirred him, yet this felt different. He'd reviewed the camera footage a dozen times, the precision, the speed, Rex Granger's surgical removal from the playing field. Not a fight, a demonstration. Alara met his gaze as she passed. No defiance, no swagger, just her customary quiet reserve. Yet, a subtle but profound shift had occurred in her periphery. An atmospheric change even hardened inmates now perceived with awe and apprehension. Later, in the library, the accustomed murmur of hushed conversations and rustling pages yielded to an almost reverent quiet. Prisoners, notorious for their disregard of rules, spoke in softer tones, met her eyes, even offered tentative nods as she moved among the shelves. She felt the weight of their altered perceptions, a cloak woven from apprehension and nascent respect. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but undeniably effective. No one questioned her book choices or sniped at her intellectual pursuits. The air, once thick with implied menace, now felt remarkably clear. Warden Thorne watched from her office, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Alara Vance's file, with its previously perplexing redacted sections, now made vivid sense. A decorated martial artist indeed. The incident, a stark deviation from established power dynamics, had paradoxically brought a strange order. The yard, typically a crucible of minor skirmishes and dominance displays, had been unusually placid all morning. The prison's resident alpha had been effectively neutered, his void filled not by another brute, but by the quiet woman who put him there. A fascinating case study in leadership, or perhaps in the unexpected consequences of underestimation. During yard time, Alara sought the most isolated stretch of concrete near the chain-link fence separating recreation from the outer walls. She sat on a worn bench, a book open on her lap, but her gaze often drifted, surveying the altered landscape of her confinement. No one approached. Bullies, petty thieves, loudmouths, all kept their distance. A group playing handball, usually boisterous, lowered their voices when they glanced her way. Her silent presence cast a wide, invisible perimeter of inviolability. Officer Miller patrolled, his eyes sweeping the yard. He noted the space Alara occupied, a small island of solitude in the bustling prison. Not just physical distance, but a psychological barrier, erected by the collective understanding of her capabilities. He recalled the reports. Rex's sudden, almost graceful collapse. Unsettling, yes, but undeniably effective. The usual jostling and territorial disputes seemed to have evaporated. The yard, in its own brutal way, had found a new equilibrium. Alara closed her book, the words unread. The sun warmed her face, a rare comfort in this harsh place. This newfound deference wouldn't last forever. The currents of prison life were ever shifting. But for now, a quiet, almost fragile peace held. She was no longer merely an inmate, no longer just the librarian. She was Alara Vance, the woman who had brought down Rex the Hammer Granger. With nothing but her disciplined strength, and in the brutal hierarchy of Ironwood, that commanded a respect more potent than any shouted threat. The unseen victory. The clatter of trays and the low murmur of 100 conversations still filled the mess hall. But now, a subtle ripple preceded Alara's arrival. It wasn't a hush, not exactly, but a recalibration. Heads that had once turned away in disinterest now swiveled, a fleeting glance, a flicker of something, akin to deference in their eyes. She still chose the same solitary table in the corner, the one furthest from the boisterous center, and still ate her unappetizing rations with the same quiet dignity. But the space around her, once a magnet for idle chatter and occasional jostling, had become an invisible perimeter. No one encroached. No one even brushed past too closely. The air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken understanding. Her books remained her constant companions. Today, it was a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its pages dog-eared and softened by countless readings. She traced a finger along a particularly resonant passage about inner peace, the faint smell of old paper and dust, a comforting anchor in the harsh reality of ironwood. No one dared to snatch it from her hands. No one sneered at her intellect. The intimidation that had been a constant hum beneath the surface of daily life had evaporated, replaced by a quiet respect, tinged with a healthy dose of apprehension. Outside, in the main yard, the change was even more pronounced. The cacophony of shouting and roughhousing had not vanished entirely, but its epicenter had shifted away from Alara. Where she chose to sit, often on a sun-warmed concrete bench beneath a scraggly tree, a pocket of tranquility formed. Inmates who previously would have played cards nearby, their voices rising in argument or laughter, now found other spots. The basketball court, once a battleground of elbows and curses, still saw its share of aggressive play, but the players seemed to instinctively avoid straying too close to her self-imposed sanctuary. Even the guards, typically indifferent to the minute social calibrations of the yard, seemed to cast her an extra glance, a mixture of wariness and something unreadable in their expressions. Alara felt the weight of it, this new, unspoken authority. It was a strange burden, one she had never sought. Her actions against Rex had not been a power play, but a desperate act of self-preservation, a flicker of instinct that had ignited decades of dormant training. Yet, in the brutal calculus of ironwood, self-preservation, when executed with such devastating precision, was indistinguishable from a claim to dominance. She had, without uttering a single threat, or raising her voice in anything but defense, reshaped the entire ecosystem of the prison yard. One afternoon, a new inmate, a burly woman with a shaved head and tattoos snaking up her neck, strode purposefully towards Alara's bench. Alara continued reading, her gaze unwavering from the page. The woman stopped a few feet away, her shadow falling across the open book. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity, a ripple of expectation. This was it. The silent observers seemed to think. A challenge. Alara slowly raised her head, her eyes, the color of deep river stone. Meeting the newcomers, there was no fear in them, no aggression, just a quiet, unwavering calm. The tattooed woman's bluster seemed to deflate just a fraction under that steady gaze. She shifted her weight, a subtle discomfort entering her posture. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, she cleared her throat and mumbled, "Mind if I, sit here?" Her voice was rough, but lacked the usual edge of defiance. Alara simply gestured to the empty space on the bench beside her. The woman sat, not too close, but not overly distant either. She didn't speak again, nor did Alara. They simply sat. Two disparate figures sharing a bench, a silent testament to the new, subtle order. The new inmate, after a few minutes, pulled out a tattered paperback of her own, a romance novel, ironically, and began to read, occasionally glancing at Alara with a flicker of something akin to wonder. This was Alara's victory, unseen and unheard. It wasn't a triumph heralded by shouts or boasts, but by the absence of them. It was in the sudden quiet that now accompanied her, the respectful distance maintained, the unspoken acknowledgement that some forces, though outwardly serene, were best left undisturbed. She hadn't sought to rule Ironwood, only to exist within it. Yet, in defending her right to that existence, she had inadvertently become its most formidable and most peaceful power. The guards might still hold the keys, but Alara Vance held a different kind of sway, one forged not in iron, but in the sudden, shattering realization that true strength often lay hidden until it was absolutely needed.